All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's Science Seminar Series. Today we are lucky to have Dr. Kristen Kieta joining us on Zoom to give us her talk. And next week we will be joined by Bria Melly from the University of Calgary, speaking on qualitative insights into effective strategies for diagnosing and treating apathy in Parkinson's disease. This week, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Kristen Kieta from the University of Northern British Columbia's Department of Geography and Earth and Environmental Sciences. Dr. Kieta finished her PhD in 2023, investigating different methods in the field of sediment fingerprinting, as well as focusing on the impact of wildfire on the Nechako River in central BC. Prior to her PhD, her master's focused on the effectiveness of vegetated buffer strips on phosphorus reduction in agricultural landscapes in Morden, Manitoba. Before graduate school, Kieta worked on the U.S. Geological Survey in Minnesota on a range of projects related to water quality, primarily on the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. Her main interests lie in water quality and quantity issues associated with large-scale disturbances and the impacts of restoration and conservation techniques after these disturbances. The title of her talk today is After the Smoke Has Cleared, the Impacts of Wildfire on Soils and Sediments in the Nechako and Deadman River Watersheds. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kristen Kieta.
Thanks for the introduction. I was introduced, I'm Kristen Kieta. I'm working at the University of Northern BC, which is in Prince George on the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh First Nation. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work I did during my PhD on wildfires, and now the work I'm doing on wildfires in a postdoc down on the Deadman River, and kind of hoping to contrast these two watersheds for you and see, show you that, no two wildfires are the same and no two responses are the same. But before I get into the meat of these two different watersheds and the work I'm doing, I come from a background that has absolutely nothing to do with wildfires. I grew up in rural Ohio. I was more worried about tornadoes than I was worried about wildfires. So I started my PhD in 2018 in the fall, and that summer, a large portion of the Nechako watershed burned. So suddenly my project was going to have, at least some part of it was going to have to do with wildfire. So I had to do quite a bit of learning. And the one thing you learn right away is that watersheds will respond to wildfire. And typically what you hear is that a wildfire occurs and hydrophobic soils are created. So basically, if you're looking at that diagram at the top, when you get burning soils and burning vegetation, it creates gases that move down into the soil, and it creates this hydrophobic layer. And so in theory, you have a rainstorm, you get major runoff, you get landslides, you get debris flows. But what I quickly learned is that is not necessarily always the case. So you can see in the bottom left, there's that really old looking diagram. And it is old, but it is still very relevant and very useful. And what it's showing here is that you actually can have a high severity wildfire, but if after the wildfire you don't get a large rainstorm, then you're not going to have necessarily this big response that we see on TV often. Similarly, you can have a medium to low severity fire, and if you get a major rainstorm, that can turn into a big watershed response. So that's actually happened in British Columbia in 2021. There were a series of massive wildfires, and then there was an atmospheric river that came through, and it wiped out the roads and the bridges, and the lower mainland of British Columbia was actually cut off from the rest of the province because all the highways had to be closed. So no two fires are ever going to respond the same, and there's tons of variables that impact how the watershed will respond. My primary focus and interest is on sediment and the sediment response to fire. So if you look at the diagram on the left, you can think about any watershed wherever you are, any creek. You're going to have your banks, and then you've got some benches as you go up, and then you go into the upslope part of the field or whatever it is, forest. And when you have a lot of grasses and shrubs and trees, you can imagine that sediment will be stored at these various locations on the hill slope because of all the things, basically physical barriers to them moving into the creek. And then you can imagine what would happen when everything burns and you don't have trees left. Sometimes the burns are so severe that you don't have stumps, you don't have any grasses left, the organic layer of soil is gone. And in those situations, it's just asking for large amounts of sediment to be transported. And as I'll talk about in the next slide, it will change the hydrologic response. So your rivers can come up higher, which is going to increase your bank erosion and that type of thing. So one like very prescient example is in British Columbia, pretty close to where I'm doing my postdoc, down near Kamloops, for those who know where that is. And it was in the Fish Trap and Jameson watershed. So Fish Trap was a watershed that most of it burned. Jameson was a watershed of similar size and topography that didn't burn. And what you can see from that little bar graph there is that the amount of sediment that moved was similar in these two watersheds, but in Fish Trap, which burned, it was quite a bit earlier. And that's likely due to this hydrologic response to wildfire. So one of the things that we maybe don't always think about right away is that you lose your tree canopy. So that has a lot of impacts. That means there's not a canopy to intercept rainfall or snow. And in our case, one of the big impacts is the snowfall. So you can imagine that when you have the canopy, some of the snow will stay in the canopy. And even when it makes its way down to the land, it's then going to have some shade and protection from forest. So if you've ever walked through a forest, even in BC, at least in May or June, you can often have tons of snow in the forest. Even though the valleys and the open land, there's no snow left. And that's because of that shading. So when you lose that shading from the canopy, you often will just move your hydrologic curve forward. So you can see in that graph there at the top, what Fish Trap was doing, which again was the burned watershed, was following what Jameson was doing. So you saw this peak, really nice peak typically happening in May down there when the snow melts. And then after the wildfire, that peak just moves forward a bit. And it's a bit of a muted response because you have a longer peak. It's not so sharp. So that's just hopefully giving you some of the background on these responses to wildfire. Again, thinking that just remembering that as diverse as British Columbia is, no two wildfires really are going to act the same, which was something I had to really drill into my head when reading a lot of the background. So BC is broken up into all these different biogeoclimatic zones, or if you hear me refer to Beck zones, that's what I'm talking about. So I thought I'd put this map up because I'm going to put it up twice during the presentation, once to show you the Nechako, and then once again to show you the Deadman, because these are two quite different watersheds. So the Nechako watershed is situated basically where I'm sitting right now. It meets the Fraser River here in Prince George. And you can see it's in the subboreal spruce to the SBS Beck zone. Parts of it are high mountains. You get a little bit of the subalpine fir, but mostly where we worked was down in the valleys at lower elevation, so subboreal spruce. It gets maybe 400 millimeters of precipitation a year, but most of that falls in the way of snow. And the topography here is pretty flat for British Columbia. So these aren't the areas where you're going downhill skiing. This is more of a cross-country type of place. So just to put that in perspective. So the basin itself is quite large. It's got a drainage area of over 47,000 square kilometers. And you can see from here, it's mostly forest, coniferous forest and mixed forest. There is a bit of an agricultural belt near the town of Vanderhoof, which you can kind of see in the southeastern part of the basin where all that pink and red is. And then you can see in the southwest part of the basin, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the next slide, is the Nechako Reservoir. And that reservoir exists because of the Kenny Dam and the Skins Lake spillway. So that reservoir actually was a naturally occurring chain of lakes, but when they built the dam, the lakes expanded, so a lot of area was flooded. And then quite a bit of wildfire burned in 2018, which I'll show in a couple maps from now. But I want you to focus your attention basically directly in the middle of where that upper arm comes through, and there's that red outline. And that's the Shovel Lake fire, and that's the fire that I focused on for my research. It's quite a large fire, the largest of the 2018 fires. So the dam and spillway are really important when thinking about the hydrology and the geomorphology of this system, because as you can see from the bottom right photo, that's the Kenny Dam. It's an earthen dam, and there's no water that is released at the dam itself. So that used to be where the Nechako began, and it's now a dry canyon. So instead, water's released about 75 kilometers away at the Skins Lake spillway, which you can see in that upper photo. And that flows into the Chislata system, so Chislata Lake, and then the Chislata River, and then meets up to where it would have been where the Nechako was, and that becomes the Nechako River now. In addition to this, there's about half of the water that's stored in the reservoir is never released into the Nechako system, and that's water that would typically be in this watershed. It's actually pumped out of the watershed to produce power for Rio Tinto's aluminum smelter on the coast. In addition to that, right now the dam does not release water on like an ecological schedule. They hold back a lot of water in the spring because they're mandated to release water from mid-July to mid-August, which is when the salmon are running. So they need to keep water temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius. But as you can imagine, that flow, when they ramp it up from, say, 50 cubic meters per second to 450, that's going to create a sediment response in and of itself, just the release of that water. So you're resuspending a lot of sediment, which is not always good for the salmon that are spawning because a significant amount of turbidity is created. And then finally, another important thing to consider when I was working in such a big system, is that what can seem quite catastrophic at the time and large scale, which was the 2018 fires, is actually just part of this system. So the thing that you probably first noticed from this map is the gold color everywhere. So those are the cut blocks in this in the watershed. And behind that are the little dots. And so a big reason that there's so many cut blocks here is because essentially the entire basin was infested with the mountain pine beetle, which killed something like 70% of merchantable timber in British Columbia. And so this mountain pine beetle epidemic led to a lot of cut blocks. There's also some evidence that with all that dead wood and the stuff that wasn't harvested, it can lead to fire behavior or change fire behavior. So it's not a one-to-one, it's not dead trees equals fire, but just something to keep in mind that these things all have an impact on the system that I was working in. And one thing that you might be thinking of is like, okay, then Nechako is this weird, obscure watershed in northern BC, like 5 people live up there. Like, why do you care? And the reason is that there are major aquatic ecosystem concerns in the basin, and wildfire is just one small reason for that. But the Nechako it feeds the Fraser River, which is, arguably BC's most iconic and important river. And it has sockeye and Chinook salmon. It's also home to what is now the endangered Nechako white sturgeon. And so there's been precipitous declines in populations for all of these species. The most harmed by it have been the Nechako white sturgeon. And the big issue is that sediment is moving through the system, and the spawning habitat for all 3 of these species is near the town of Vanderhoof, which is near that agricultural belt, kind of in the middle of that last map you would have seen. And the problem is that sand and fine sediment coming from all over the basin are filling in that spawning habitat. And then both sturgeon and sockeye, they spawn in different ways, but similar in that they need cobbles where there's space that they can build their redds to leave their eggs. So when that's all filled in, it armors the stream, and they don't have that ability. So there's been a major reduction in juvenile success. So really, the point of all the research you're going to see today is really thinking about fish and the communities that do use these fish. There's 17 First Nations communities in this watershed, and outside of Prince George, there are some towns that 2,000-3,000 people. So thinking about this all in the context of aquatic ecosystem health. And then the last background slide I'll give you before I get into the meat of the talk, just a bit of a background on polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which was something that was new to me before I started my PhD. But PAHs are formed through the incomplete combustion of organic matter. So you could think of that in the wildfire context as burning trees and shrubs and burning soils, but they're also formed every time we burn fossil fuels. So when you get in your car and you drive, we're creating PAHs. They are, the reason we were concerned about these is because they are also known to be such a big thing that comes from fires, and they are carcinogenic and potentially toxic, particularly for invertebrates and the fish that feed on those invertebrates. They're also hydrophobic. So another reason for focusing in on them for this project was that they are found in higher concentrations in soils and then in the particulate form in rivers. And not a lot is known on how they break down, how they move. So that's what this project was honing in on. So you can see this diagram here just briefly. PAHs can be admitted to the atmosphere and then deposited in the river. They'll be deposited in the soil and then run off. So there's lots of different ways for PAHs to make it into the aquatic ecosystem. Okay, so for my research here, there were kind of two buckets that the research objectives fall into. So you have contamination, and then we did fingerprinting. So the first thing was to determine the sources of PAHs because, like I said before, they're produced both from vegetation burning, but also from humans burning fossil fuels. And then looking at over time how these pH concentrations have changed both in soils and sediments. And then also think about that on a spatial scale. So how close to the fire do you have to be to see this PAH signal? And then moving to the fingerprinting side of things, we're determining if burned areas are going to be a major source to the tributaries and the main stem of the Nechako. And then determining if these PAHs can be used as a potential suite of tracers. And then also testing the use of color in a wildfire, which had been used previously, but not as much as some other soil properties. So now we're zooming in again on that Shovel Lake fire, and I chose three tributaries that were most impacted. So Ormond Creek, the green one, purple one, which is Tatsutnai, and then 9 Mile Creek. And you can see they burned in different ways. So most of Ormond Creek was burned, but it's significantly larger. Then you see around 80% of Tatsutnai burned, or 76%, and then just under half of 9 Mile Creek burned. The interesting thing to think about here is you can see that Tats and 9 Mile drain directly into the Nechako, whereas Ormond, which was the most burned and potentially the most impacted, drains into Fraser Lake. So then there would be a buffer of the impacts on Ormond Creek to the river itself because it would have to move through Fraser Lake. So obviously one of the first steps was to go out as soon as we were able to in 2018 after the fire and collect soil samples. So we chose 5 burn sites and 5 unburned sites. And at the burn sites, we sampled what at the time we called ash, but was kind of the burned organic and ash layer. And then we sampled topsoil, which you can see in that bottom photo is really clear, that like top 2 centimeters, it was clearly burned. And then what we would call actually subsurface soil, so from about 2 centimeters down to 10 centimeters. And then we collected that topsoil and subsurface soil from unburned sites as well. So we did that sampling in 2018. Then we returned in 2020 and 2021 to collect the burned topsoil again. And then for part of the fingerprinting work, we collected RDS, which is road deposited sediment. And then we collected bank samples. So you can see like a pretty large bank there in the top right photo. And that's in one of the tributaries. So these were all analyzed for PAHs, color, and then we did particle size and loss on ignition. So just so that you get an idea, kind of try to remember what these photos look like in comparison to what you're going to see in the Deadman. So you can see not tons of slope here, not really steep slopes like you will see. The picture on the top right is a good example of a pretty severe fire. So while there are trees standing, they're obviously dead, and a fair number of those trees were birch, which when deciduous trees burn, that's a really clear showing of a highly severe fire, high severity fire. Whereas you can see in the photos on the left side, there is some vegetation left in some of those places. That was a young plantation that had burned, so really small trees. And then the photo on the bottom right, so that this isn't like all doom and gloom, is a burned area that was a low severity fire that by 2020 was already seeing quite a bit of regrowth of that low-lying vegetation. So it wasn't just a moonscape 2 years after the fire. And then, of course, the sediment sampling. So we started sampling in October of 2018. My last samples were collected in September of 2021. That was obviously, this is northern BC, so these creeks mostly freeze, and then Nechako freezes in places. So typically we'd put our samplers in maybe late April or early May, and they would come out in September, October, November, depending on the year. So again, we had those 3 tributaries and then 3 sites on the main stem of the Nechako. And the samplers we used are these time integrated passive samplers. So really it's just a big tube that you can leave in the creek. We left them in for 2 weeks at a time and would empty them every 2 weeks. The water will flow into the sampler, flows down so the sediment settles out, and then you empty it and you get all the sediment and the water that's in this tube. And then, so again, we analyze these for the same things, those PAHs, color, and then those other physical properties. Okay, so I'll start here with soil contamination by PAHs. And so what I'm showing you on the left, those are just 8 of the 16 parent PAHs. And the ones at the top are low molecular weight, and on the bottom are high molecular weight. So kind of the major differences is the low molecular weight we know are produced through wildfire in really high concentrations. High molecular weight, a little less so, but high molecular weight are also even more likely to be bound to soils and sediments because of their complex structure. So what we found was in the burned ash, like organic material samples, all the concentrations of phenanthrene and naphthalene, which are 2-ring pHs, were above soil quality guidelines. But even in 2018, directly like the same season as the fire, only 3 of the samples were above those concentrations. So that's a really good news story. If you look at the comparison over time, so that's on the right side, 2018, 2020, and 2021. In 2018 is the only year we sampled the unburned, and you can see those concentrations, now we're looking at total pHs, are significantly higher than the unburned sites. And they're still significantly higher in 2020, but the concentrations have fallen pretty significantly. And then again in 2021, those concentrations have fallen again. They're not quite back to the unburned background levels, but getting close. And the intention is actually to go out this year and sample what would probably be the final time to see if those concentrations are back down to essentially background. So now we'll look at the concentrations of PAHs in sediments. And the first thing is I want you to draw your attention to the y-axis and just notice that those are different. So in the tributaries, it's a much smaller axis, so up to 75, whereas in the bottom there, it's up to 200. So in the tributaries, the story was pretty well as expected. We saw a big spike in 2018, which would have been after the fire, and there had been some snow events and some rain events, nothing major, but enough to bring that level up. Then you see in 2019, the concentrations have fallen, but still a bit elevated. And then as time goes on, those concentrations fall to be quite low. Because remember, these are adding up all 16 of those parent PAHs, and we're way down in the 15 nanogram per gram range. So really small concentrations here. The story in the main stem was not necessarily unsurprising in that we didn't see these really high concentrations of PAHs. Kind of thought we might because of the amount of fire, but at the same time, there's a big dilution effect with all the creeks that come in to the Nechako main stem. But what was quite strange was these really high peaks in the Nechako at Vanderhoof, because that was the site that was the furthest away from the fire itself, from any of the fires really. And you see this big spike in 2019, which, yeah, it's the first spring, but those concentrations are really high. So this is where that first objective came from, which was what actually are the sources of PAHs in the tributaries and in the main stem. So we'll start by just kind of walk you through these plots because they're both simple and a bit complicated. So each box plot is all of the samples from, say, Ormond Creek, Tatsutai, 9 Mile. So that's what each box is. And what you're seeing on the x-axis are the various sources of PAHs. So the most important ones are kind of the ones on the far left. So that's DVEM, VAVG, ASH, and CRE2. And then the ones that are in those red boxes are actually my samples of burned organic material and the burned topsoil. And this was a chi-squared analysis. And so the values closer to 0 mean that that's where the sources of PAHs most likely were from. So what you can see is in the tributaries, all 6 of those first ones are about quite similar in that they were closest to the sediment samples. So we can say that those DVEM is diesel vehicle emissions. The next one is average vehicle emissions, asphalt, and creosote soaked rail ties, which actually are quite prominent in the Nechako. So we could say those were the burned organic material and burned topsoil were definitely important, but so were those vehicle emissions. So it's kind of a mixed bag here. And then when you drop down and look at the main stem site, it's a bit of a different story. The fire is not playing as big of a role. So we see that those human-induced PAHs or human-created PAHs from vehicles and creosote soaked rail ties are really driving the PAHs in the main stem of the river. And some data that I won't show you is another way you can figure out these sources of PAHs is through molecular ratios. And when I used these molecular ratios, I had very similar results. So it's good to see that both of these lined up. So we have kind of mixed sources of PAHs in the tributaries and more fossil fuel-based sources in the main stem, which would also explain those big spikes at the Nechako at Vanderhoof that's saying, okay, those are spikes from other sources than from the fire. So the next part of this project was to determine the sources of sediment. So that was more contamination, sources of PAHs, and this is the amount of, or the sources of sediment. So the sediment fingerprinting approach is pretty straightforward, I would say, in theory. You collect samples from your relevant sources. So in this case, that was the banks and the road deposited sediment and then the burned and the unburned areas. You collect sediment samples from the river, which we had done for the contamination part of the study. You analyze them for those various constituents. So for us, it was PAHs and color. And then using an unmixing model, you can determine the proportions of these sources in the sediment. So, you got 5% from source A, 35 from source B, etc. So one of the first things you have to do with fingerprinting is make sure that your properties actually can break off these different sources. So you want those circles to not really be touching because that means they're discriminating really well between sources. So on the left, you have tributaries, and on the right is the main stem. So you can see the main stem, those look primo. You've got all these, the four sources are very obviously discriminated: banks, road deposited sediment, unburned soil, and burned topsoil. It's a little bit of a different story in the tributaries. You do see some overlap between the burned topsoil and the burned organic material, but that's to be expected. And you have good discrimination between the other sources. So again, like tons going on in this slide, but quite interesting actually. So these are the model results from the tributaries, which to be honest, were much more interesting than the main stem, which I'll show here in a minute. But Ormond Creek, which was the much bigger watershed, it also had some issues with the pipeline that was going through. And so the creek had to be diverted briefly, and it changed significantly during this period. We see a major contribution from the banks. So that's kind of the story here is, for the most part, you're seeing like well above 50% is coming from the banks. So the more interesting stories here would be at Tatsuutnai and 9 Mile Creek. So you can remember 9 Mile only burned just under 50%, whereas Tatsuutnai was up in the 70s. And you do still see that banks are quite important, but you can also see that the burned topsoil plays a pretty major role here and is a bigger contributor than the unburned topsoil. And that kind of goes in ups and downs. So which is likely dependent both on snowmelt and also on precipitation. And the story is similar in 9 Mile. We didn't have as much material moving through there, which is why you see the gaps in the data. But where we do start to see things really happening is in the spring of 2020, when we start to see quite a bit of burned topsoil moving through and unburned soil in general. And that was a bigger year for snow here. So it would make sense that you saw this big flush move through there. For the main stem, the results were far less interesting, realistically. We see that banks really dominated here, which is not a surprise based on other research that's been done in the watershed that showed banks to be a major contributor. This is likely because of the way that the Rio Tinto controls flows in the watershed. It's also likely because of the way that the watershed has just moved completely. It's now going through the Chislata system, so there's still a lot of material there. And this area, the Nechako River in particular, is known for these large cut banks. So if you're paddling, you can see these huge banks that are exposed. So it wasn't surprising to us that we weren't seeing this big burn signal, and also just because of the dilution factor. So what are some of the takeaways from this research? Wildfires were definitely an important source of PAHs, which was an interesting finding because most of the research done thus far on PAHs focuses in on industrial areas. So seeing that, wildfire in this area with very little industry, wildfires were definitely showing up, but they weren't high enough to be overly concerned about because they were never above any of the soil or sediment quality guidelines. And burn material was important in the tributaries, but not necessarily in the main stem of the river, which is important for watershed managers moving forward when thinking about any sort of rehabilitation, focusing more on specific tributaries rather than on the main stem and this massive watershed, which can be quite overwhelming. Okay, so now we're going to drive 6 hours away and head to the Deadman watershed. So if you remember this slide from before, the Nechako was in that SBS zone in the middle of the province. Now we're going to move down to interior Douglas fir and ponderosa pine territory. So the other things to know about the Deadman watershed, significantly steeper than what we were seeing in the Nechako. And I have some photos that I hope can get that point across. It's also significantly drier. It's quite arid. The vegetation that grows other than the trees is a lot of sagebrush grass. So it's just a completely different type of watershed. So remembering that, no two watersheds are ever going to respond the same to a wildfire. So here's a photo of a map of the Deadman. You can see this project is led by the Skeetchson Indian Band, and the reserve there is at the very bottom of the watershed. You can see there has been definitely been logging, significant logging in the area, but less logging than has occurred in the Nechako. And you can see those bright green dots, which are the ISCO sites, which I'll talk more about what an ISCO is, but those are our sediment sampling sites. You can also see there's like some shaded light pink area on the western side of this map. And that's the 2017 Elephant Hill Fire, which did consume some of the Deadman. And then the dark red outline with the hatching is the Sparks Lake Fire, which occurred in 2021, which is really the focus for us here. And the Deadman River watershed, for those semi-familiar with BC, is just about 50 kilometers west of the city of Kamloops. And it drains into the Thompson River, which is the biggest drainage for the Fraser River. So some connections there with the Nechako. So here's a really nice fire severity map. So the Deadman itself really flows basically north-south. So that area of high and medium burn, kind of in the western part of the burn, that's the Deadman River. And then Chris Creek, the other area we're working on, kind of goes northeast from there. And again, you can see that where it dumps in from there, it's about 50 kilometers to Kamloops. The Deadman was, it's burned 90,000 hectares, which is quite large in 2021, which is over half of the watershed. And one of the big reasons for the project, and the reason that Skeetchson is leading this project, is that it is their source of drinking water. And both culturally and ecologically, coho, steelhead, and Chinook salmon are really important in the Deadman. So thinking about their habitat and the potential for food loss and cultural significance here. So immediately after the wildfires, Skeetchson developed harvesting guidelines so that salvage operations wouldn't just be like adding clear cuts to the landscape. They've already started planting with Ministry of Forests, and then pursuing a lot of funding for other restoration work, primarily in stream and in the riparian zone. So that's where my part of the work comes in. So this project is operating a little differently than most of the projects I've probably ever worked on. So after the fire, Skeetchson Community Chief Council got together with a management team from the Pacific Salmon Foundation, their Skeetchson Natural Resource Corporation, their resource corporation, and then Urban Systems, which is a consultant, to come up with a plan for the watershed. So that plan moved to the restoration team, who also includes all ministries and consultants and Skeetchson itself, and they came up with a plan. So their plan was to do these different treatments, which I'll get to in the next slide. And our job as the science team, which includes multiple universities and the government, is to monitor the response to these various restoration techniques. And then when we have our findings, we'll go and report those back to Skeetchson. So we have a meeting at the end of October where we'll go talk about what we found thus far. That knowledge then goes back to a technical advisory group who goes to Skeetchson, and the whole cycle repeats itself. So the idea is like, this is not a one-off project. This is going to be constantly occurring over the next few years, and hopefully even beyond, by adding some capacity to Skeetchson for them to do their own monitoring of the watershed. So there's a bunch of treatments happening: land, channel, road treatments, and then interestingly, some beaver work. So on the land, there's been mulching that's already taken place and a lot of tree planting. Within the channel, there's a lot of bank stabilization work and creating aquatic habitat, because the fire didn't necessarily destroy all the riparian areas, but the riparian areas have already been depleted from farming, and there's a lot of ranching here. So cattle are making their way into the creek, trampling down banks. And then you add that to the idea of, the loss of vegetation. We're having some serious issues in stream and in the banks. And then the road deactivation is just another way of reducing the impact on the landscape. And then moving beavers so that they're holding water in the upper part of the watershed where it burned, rather than in the lower part of the watershed where it can have an impact on the folks that live on the Skeetchson Reserve. So it's a massive project. So I'm going to just talk about our little bit, but just to give you an idea, there's cabin sampling, which is a mix of invertebrate sampling, fish sampling, and some geomorphic sampling. That's being led by Thompson Rivers University. The DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, is doing some primary production, stream metabolism type work. There's hill slope runoff experiments that are taking place in the treatments and then in areas that have been untreated. And then we're working again with sediment and soil sampling, particularly in Chris Creek, and then working with these ISCO samplers at 6 sites, so 3 on the Deadman and 3 on Chris Creek that you can see in this map. And again, I'll explain what an ISCO sampler is just here in a minute. So again, I wanted to show some photos so you can kind of get a better idea of what this watershed looks like, definitely in comparison to the Nechako. So this is a photo, I'm kind of up on a road looking out at the Chris Creek watershed. So you can see how significant the burn was. There's very few even trees with needles on, let alone live trees. And the picture will never do it justice, but just how steep this is. And that really coarse, ridiculous blue line that I drew is where the creek is. So you can see there's just not much holding anything back from moving into the creek. And the other thing about sagebrush grass areas is that there's often, these plumes of sagebrush grass, but then the area around it is exposed soil. So there's just not a ton holding. There's not a lot of grasslands here that are holding soil down. And so see, these are some of the creeks. The photos on the left are 2 of the sites where we have, if you squint, you can probably see the little Phillips traps in the upper left photo. And then the photo on the bottom is just another one of our sites. You can see it's not completely wiped out everywhere. There is some riparian vegetation and some trees that are left standing. But then the photo on the right is this is farther up the Deadman. And this we were there last April trying to kind of suss out where we would put our sites. And it had rained a bit, the days leading up to us going there. We got there, this was just like a bit of a trickle of maybe murky water. Then it turned into like, okay, this is a bit more than a trickle. And then it was just this big gully that was formed and like just incredible amounts of sediment moving across the road and then directly into the Deadman. So this is just a landscape that's far different. Hopefully from that photo, you can also see how steep those slopes are. And so this is just another photo to kind of show where we're working and what we're doing. So you can see the Phillips traps again in that top middle photo and me scraping off some topsoil for some pH analysis. And then the photos on the far left and far right are of these ISCO samplers. So for those who aren't familiar with an ISCO, they're really neat. They look like a little R2D2 that you just put on the bank. And then there's a tube that goes down into the creek that you hammer into the creek with rebar. And they are set in our project to take 1 sample every day for 24 straight days. And then you go and flip out the bottles and you get this. So at all 6 of our sites, every day at 2 p.m., 1 liter of water is taken from each of these sites. So you get a really nice time scale. You can get a really nice temporal scale for this project all the way from April when we can put them in to when we have to take them out in October and November again because of the freezing. So the idea with these ISCOs is that you'll analyze them for their suspended sediment concentration, suspended particulate matter, so you can get organic and inorganic. And if you pair that with discharge, you can understand the loads that are moving through these sites at any given time. So the idea is to have them spaced out through Chris Creek and the Deadman where there's restoration happening in between them and see if those restoration techniques are working. But like I said, one thing we wanted to do was continue with this idea of pH contamination. So the green are the samples that you would have seen from the Nechako. So those were taken the same year as the fire in 2018. We went back last year and sampled a fire from 2017, and that's the WL on the far left. So those are really low. And then SL, those teal bars, those are the Shovel Lake fire, which occurred in 2021, but weren't sampled until 2023, and they're quite low. And then the interesting thing to look at is the 2023. So that's RM was a fire near Kamloops, and TL was another fire in the Nechako. And those were fires in 2023, sampled in 2023. And you can see they're quite different, and that they're lower compared to what we found in the Shovel Lake fire in 2018 in the Nechako. So just trying to keep this going, and we'll resample at these sites, see if we can start to glean any sort of patterns with severity or time or slopes as to what's happening with these pHs after fires. Okay, so then we'll just look at some of the data from 2023 and 2024 from these ISCO sites. So here what we're looking at is suspended particulate matter, and this is measured in milligrams per liter. So I haven't put this with discharge yet to calculate total daily loads. And these samples are just from August of 23 and September of 2023, when we were able to get all of our ISCOs going. What you can see, this is really base flows. These are low flows. Even this part of the province doesn't even get big time fall rainstorms. And you can just see that Chris Creek is typically lower than the Deadman. And this doesn't really change until there's some sort of precipitation event, and then you might see Chris Creek popping up. And so to give you an idea of what we're dealing with when we're talking about base flows versus these higher flows, tried to get two photos from similar vantage point. So I would draw your attention here to that rock, which goes from, underwater to being fully submerged. And you can just see the differences here based on just the watercolor. It's quite clear. You can see those cobbles in 2023. And then in 2024, it's just a muddy mess. Obviously unable to get into the creeks. You can just see these major differences. And that's what these ISCO samplers are really nice for. We can get, one sample from every day to catch these changes. And so for the data that I've analyzed so far from this year, the big thing you can see is that, so the Deadman had a really low snowpack last year, like most of British Columbia. So they would typically see a spike because it's warmer down there. Things melt early, so they typically melt in April. We should see our big spike. And we didn't see that at all last year. But what we did see was Chris Creek, particularly Lower Chris Creek, really responding to those rain events that we had in late May and early June. Those rain events were big enough that they ripped out some of our ISCO intake tubes and lost some of our Phillips traps. So again, these are just, the system it's new to us, so we're definitely learning a lot. But for now, you can see how high those concentrations got, closing in on over 600 milligrams per liter in Lower Chris Creek this summer. But now again, we're back into the base flow low period and things have really fallen off, really low concentration. Okay, so I'll just wrap this up by saying, so the Deadman River definitely has higher concentrations during these low and base flows, but Chris Creek is contributing more sediment. And this is really important for Keechisan because right now a lot of the restoration efforts have been put into the Deadman because that is the main stem. But what we're seeing is that Chris Creek is actually this massive contributor of sediment to the Deadman. So thinking about doing some work on Chris Creek would be really important. And again, these concentrations are really low during base flows. We just have to wait for those big rain events. And then you see concentrations exceeding what is the quantified limit for BC, over 100 milligrams per liter. We also, one thing I didn't talk about here is that we've been analyzing these samples for total and dissolved metals, as well as dissolved anions. And we haven't seen any high concentration. So that's a bit of a good news story. Nothing is exceeding, even remotely close to exceeding any of the Canadian water quality guidelines. And so as you can tell, this project is definitely in its infancy. So working more with Keechisan to develop and hone in on where the restoration should be done. And then our own continued monitoring and some monitoring by the other folks, including some really neat work the province is doing to look at some of the more large scale landslides and debris flows that have occurred in the watershed. Because we're really seeing the small scale impacts and LIDAR, can have this broader look at the whole watershed and where these mass movements are occurring. Yeah, so obviously I wouldn't be able to do any of this work without funding and collaborators, especially this new project with Keechisan. It's really neat to work with, NGOs and government and private industry and lots of other universities. And then up here, UNBC and the Nechako groups are doing really good work and really helped me out throughout my PhD. And that is all I have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kieta. That was an amazing talk. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us. So now I'm going to open up the floor for any questions. Make sure you speak nice and loudly so the owl can pick you up.
So I have a question. So in the lower downstream of the Nechako, you saw really high concentrations of PAHs. So what's the hypothesis of why that's happening? I'm not certain if I just missed it or whether we're just not certain.
Yeah, I'm not certain. I would like to surmise, and I've been doing some surmising that, so Vanderhoof is the only town, obviously, in the major town in the city center or in the watershed. So it does have 3 mills, a pellet plant. And the big thing that was happening throughout my PhD that I don't know that I fully understood the scale of was the building of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And so it was the population of Vanderhoof doubled. There were lots of not only just personal pickup trucks being added to the area, but also massive industrial equipment. And there was also a workers camp right near Vanderhoof, which would mean there was tons of increased traffic in that area. So part of me just wonders if we just saw like a human contribution that we weren't, that was new and unexpected. Because if it was just, if I was missing something with the fire picture, you would have expected to pick that up at like the Nechako at Dog Creek, for instance, because it's closer to the fire and there's nothing else going on there. So I think we're just picking this up from like the spike from the city of Vanderhoof.
Do you think there's any, because I'm assuming like the grain sizes are getting sorted as it moves through. Is it just related to that, or could it be like? I'm assuming
I
they're
guess,
bound to clays and other smalls and organics and things like that.
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and we only sieved for this project because you need so much mass. We only sieved to like 1 millimeter rather than like 63 microns or whatever to get the really fine stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think that could play a role, but the scale of the difference was just like shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, and you're even like, you're not seeing those concentrations in the tributaries where there was like, soil and like going directly in. Like, yeah, I just think that the industry piece is probably important.
Right. Thank you.
So I guess sort of on that, I was just wondering if we should be more concerned about PAHs being sourced from wildfires, or if our main concern should be from industry, or if the level is about the same.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because like sometimes it's like, well, why would you do this work if it doesn't, these concentrations are so low. So I think it's twofold. I don't think it's like worth panicking about with pHs. But I do think it's important for a couple of reasons. One is that like if you're in a system where the baseline is basically nothing, and then you do see an increase, those like fish and little bugs and crud, they're not used to even a small increase. So it could actually have a bigger impact than we thought. You could also have, so one of the experiments that's being started that's kind of associated with our work is that they're going to put salmon eggs on contaminated sediments, pH contaminated sediments, but those sediments will be contaminated at an environmentally relevant amount. So to see if it's having impacts that we're just not seeing yet on creatures. And then the last point that I'll make is that PAHs directly from wildfire are maybe not like the water quality concern that something like heavy metals or nutrients are. But when fires burn and they burn down human infrastructure, you're kind of getting a double whammy. So you can think about like the Jasper fire, you've now burned a bunch of plastics or whatever. So you kind of have like just the pHs from the fire, but also now from human infrastructure burning. So I would think like maybe let's hope that's not like a problem that occurs frequently in Canada, but that is a huge problem in places like California, where basically every fire at this point is burning down infrastructure.
Thank you.
All right, so we now have a question on Zoom.
Yeah, go ahead, Steffi.
Hi, Kristen. Thanks. It was lovely to see all the work you've been doing, and that massive project at the end sounds like really exciting to see all that collaboration. But despite all that, I'm still going to actually follow the same question theme that everyone's been asking. And I was kind of curious about indirect effects of, you were saying like, especially with the tributary from Vanderhoof, you had all these reasons why it's probably not related to the fire, but I was wondering if it could still be these human sources of PAHs, but they might be caused because of the fire, like if it's like fire mitigation responses or rebuilding after a fire or having to deal with, doing increased logging because there was a fire or something like that. All these things, you might get a greater increase from these human related causes, but that are still indirectly caused by the fire. Is that likely, or is that still a smallish amount?
No, I think that's a good point. So I haven't considered it much from the PAH perspective, although yeah, so you're going to have like, there's tons of salvage logging going on there. So you are probably also just like increasing the amount of human caused PAHs. But the one place that I think that your point is like really salient is when it comes to erosion, because it's really hard to gauge how much erosion is occurring, because I didn't do like hill slope experiments. How much of the erosion that I'm calling bank erosion is bank erosion versus you had increases in like in discharge, which is causing more bank erosion, but the increase in the discharge comes from landscapes that are denuded of vegetation.
Yeah.
So those are really hard to parse out. I think the neat thing about there is now someone in the Nechako and someone in the Deadman doing these rainfall simulation hill slope experiments. So maybe we can start to get a better idea of like, yeah, it's not directly from like, yes, you're not seeing the wildfire show up necessarily in the way you expected. It's showing up in all these other different ways.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good to see you.
So I want to ask, some persons or some agencies use control bonds in forest. So does it really have a negative effect on the soil and sediments? And if it does, what's the balance? Because doing control bonds also help to improve their vegetation. So where can we place the balance?
Sorry, Alex, it's like quite muffled. Can you either like repeat it or I don't know, move the.
So the question was a little bit about, I think prescribed burning.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
basically, are we shooting ourselves in the foot maybe with prescribed burning? Is that about right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just need to talk louder to catch the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. That's really smart. I think prescribed burning is often touted as like a solution to the wildfire problem in British Columbia. I think from a PAH perspective, they're probably okay. They're not these intense burns where you're burning up, 920 square kilometers, which is what the Shovel Lake fire did. And they're less intense. And there's some evidence that the less intense fires will emit less because you're not burning up all the needles and the trunks and the soils. You're getting like quite a low level burn. But that is a really good point. Prescribed burns so I think they're both useful and from a pH perspective, like probably not an issue. From an erosion perspective, if you're doing it in places that aren't like steep slopes near the river, probably not an issue, but not necessarily always feasible. To be honest, like when we're in as big of a drought as we are, the window for doing prescribed burns has really narrowed, especially in a place like BC. It's a bit easier in like grassland areas. But one of the bigger fires in 2021 was in Banff, and it was a prescribed burn that got out of control. So those are just like things to consider on the prescribed burn front.
Hey there, I just had a question about your soil and sediment samples. What kind of analytical or instrumental techniques do you guys use to test for pHs?
Oh man, for pHs, those are sent away to a very sophisticated lab. It's high HPM, high capillary HCML, nope, that's HM. Yeah, I don't remember, to be honest. So one of the issues is that it's really hard to get the low concentrations. So when we tried to do them in the lab that's on campus, we were just getting like non-detect, and even some of the commercial labs in BC couldn't get concentrations as low as we had. So we sent them away.
So let's switch topics a little bit. Have you been following the news in the US about with one of the largest dam removal projects, I think in US history, has happened recently? Are you familiar with it?
Oh yeah, I have a BBC article on it on my screen.
Okay, I was curious whether you've been following it and whether, I don't know, because you were talking about the Nechako River and the damming and in terms of kind of the sediment response, and so I was curious whether you could comment on how well it's going and whether we should be thinking about doing that same here in Canada.
Oh wow, this is like hot take.
Yeah,
I followed it quite closely. I have, if I didn't do my PhD on this, I had actually really hoped to try to find someone that was doing dam removal work because I find it completely fascinating, especially like, the Klamath Dam and the systems in Oregon. I think it's really important to get rid of the dams. I mean, it's not just from a sediment perspective where sediment's like backing up behind the dams, but it's like they create issues for fish, But the issue with removing dams, besides like just pretend like economics is not part of the equation. you obviously get a huge pulse of sediment. But I know that some of the dam removals they'll do them in like really small amounts at a time. So you get like a pulse and then you get weight and then you get a pulse. So it's definitely not perfect, but I don't know, from what I've read, like in Oregon, the one that they did prior to this like last one, but when they just release water at the end, it's like it takes like 5 years or so for the system to kind of sort itself out. And as long as you're, you know, thinking about it before then and how you're going to mitigate issues for fish, yeah, I'm for it.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot like that. I'm just super curious.
No, it's great.
You're probably following it, and so yeah.
Any last questions? Alrighty, well, thank you so much again, Dr. Kieta. We really appreciate you coming here on Zoom to talk to us today. Yeah, and so just as a reminder to everyone, next week we'll have Bria Melly, who will be speaking on qualitative insights into effective strategies for diagnosing and treating apathy in Parkinson's disease. So hope to see you all next week. Thank you and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.